If you've ever loved someone who keeps you at arm's length, if you've bent over backward just to feel a flicker of closeness, listen to me. It is not your imagination. The more patient, forgiving, and self-sacrificing you become, the more they seem to stay. But here's the twist. Avoidants often end up marrying the person who silently puts up with their emotional chaos. Not the one who challenges them, not the one they love the most, but the one who endures them the longest. And if that just shook something deep inside you, then you need to watch this until the end. Because what I'm about to share is going to crack open the exact psychology behind that pattern, and more importantly, what it means if you're that person. Avoidants don't fall in love the way most people imagine it. They don't get swept away by the kind of connection that demands vulnerability or intimacy. They don't lean into relationships that stretch their emotional limits or challenge them to grow. No, what they chase, consciously or not, is safety, but not the healthy kind. They chase a version of safety that is disguised as tolerance. They seek out someone who will accommodate their fears, not confront them. Someone who will keep their emotional wounds untouched, not someone who will help heal them. In their world, safety means never having to be truly seen. It means being accepted as they are, but only the part of them they're willing to show. And because of that, they don't fall for love. They fall for comfort. They fall for the absence of threat, the absence of pressure, the absence of expectation. That's what their nervous system clings to. When you love someone with avoidant attachment, it's easy to think your patience and unconditional support are building a bridge to their heart. But what's really happening far too often is that your tolerance is becoming their safety net. They're not leaning in because they feel a deeper connection. They're leaning in because you don't threaten their walls. You don't challenge their detachment. You let them stay emotionally unavailable without demanding much in return. That doesn't mean you're weak. It means you've been conditioned to think love means giving without boundaries. But from the avoidance perspective, your emotional self-restraint makes them feel like they're in control. You're not a risk. You're not a mirror reflecting their wounds back to them. You're the quiet place where they can keep hiding. And in their world, that's as close as it gets to feeling safe. This is why avoidants often find themselves drawn to partners who are overly accommodating, people who confuse loyalty with self-neglect, people who pride themselves on being low maintenance, people who feel like they're easy to love because they don't ask for too much. That's the magic formula for an avoidant. Someone who doesn't require emotional presence, who won't panic when they pull away, who won't demand resolution after conflict. They gravitate toward people who let them regulate closeness on their own terms. But here's the painful truth. When someone chooses you for how little you need, it's not love, it's survival. They're not falling in love with your soul. They're attaching to the version of you that doesn't activate their fears. And you become the safe choice, not because they feel deeply for you, but because you don't scare them into growth. At the core of avoidant attachment is an unresolved fear of engulfment and vulnerability. To them, closeness equals danger. Emotional intimacy feels like an invasion, not a connection. So they protect themselves with distance. And when you step into that space and show them you're not going to force them out of their comfort zone, they feel oddly drawn to you. They interpret your tolerance as compatibility. But what's really happening is a transaction. You offer them freedom from intimacy, and in return, they offer you the illusion of stability. But that kind of relationship is built on a lie, a quiet lie that says, if I give enough space, they'll come closer. Yet the closer you try to get, the more they retreat. And the cycle continues because you're tolerating the very behavior that keeps you emotionally starved. Avoidance will often bypass passionate, emotionally charged connections because those relationships light up every alarm bell inside them. Real love requires presence, attunement, emotional accountability. But they've been trained through trauma, neglect, or early emotional modeling. That connection is a threat. So when they meet someone who doesn't push, who doesn't probe, who doesn't require them to open up unless they're ready, they latch on. It's not love, it's relief. You become a soothing balm to their anxiety, but you're also enabling their avoidance. They may even confuse that relief for deep affection. But if you ever break character, if you ask for more, if you express dissatisfaction, if you show your emotional needs, they'll start to feel like the ground is shaking beneath them. Suddenly, the safe person doesn't feel so safe anymore. The cruel irony is that the more you accommodate their fear, the more likely they are to commit. And not because they're finally in love, but because you've proven you're not a threat. You're not the one who'll force them to look within, to confront their pain, to grow past the limitations of their emotional patterns. You're the one who'll keep the peace, the one who'll accept distance as affection, the one who'll translate silence as love. And that's why avoidants often marry the person who puts up with them, not the person who sparks their soul, not the person who awakens their heart, but the one who doesn't require them to change. Because in their world, change is terrifying, and someone who tolerates them as they are feels far safer than someone who dares to pull them closer. Being low maintenance is often praised in relationships. It's worn like a badge of honor. It's the unspoken ideal, especially around emotionally avoidant partners who flinch at the slightest pressure. Society reinforces this narrative too, celebrating the partner who doesn't complain, doesn't argue, doesn't cry, and doesn't need too much, the one who's easy to be with. But what we don't talk about is the high emotional cost that often hides beneath that label. Because in avoidant relationships, being low maintenance becomes a survival strategy. It's not always a reflection of inner peace. It's often a learned behavior, a coping mechanism. You shrink your needs. You downplay your desires. You tiptoe around their moods, hoping that by asking for less, you'll finally be enough. And to the avoidant, that makes you seem ideal because you don't interrupt their emotional distance. You don't activate their fear of closeness. You let them love you from 10 steps away without asking them to move an inch closer. Avoidants by nature are hypersensitive to expectations. They associate needs with burden. Emotional availability feels like pressure. Vulnerability feels like losing control. So when they encounter someone who doesn't push for connection, who doesn't demand consistent communication, who doesn't escalate when they withdraw, it feels like relief. That partner gets labeled as easygoing, chill, or low drama. But let's call it what it often really is: self-abandonment. You become someone who suppresses their emotional voice just to stay in the relationship. You stop bringing things up that matter to you. You silence your hurt. You normalize feeling unseen because confrontation risks distance, and distance in your mind feels like rejection. So you adapt. You tell yourself that real love doesn't need reassurance, that needing less is noble, that being low maintenance will make them stay. And that's where the confusion begins. Because over time, your willingness to tolerate their avoidant behavior starts being interpreted as strength, as maturity, as compatibility. And to the avoidant, it's incredibly attractive. They don't consciously think, this person puts up with my emotional unavailability, so I'll marry them. But that's the subconscious message. They feel safe around someone who doesn't pressure them to grow, someone who allows them to keep their emotional armor on, someone who gives space without complaint. And so they begin to mistake your endurance for love. They believe they've found a perfect match, not because of a deep emotional bond, but because you don't make them feel exposed. And if they've reached a point in their life where they're ready to settle down, they may very well choose you, not out of passion, not out of emotional intimacy, but out of comfort, out of convenience, out of habit, and because you've made it easy for them to remain avoidant. Being low maintenance often means you've been programmed to believe your needs are too much, maybe from childhood or past relationships or cultural messages that taught you love must be earned through sacrifice. So you show up in relationships trying to prove how easy you are to love. You don't complain when plans get canceled. You don't get upset when affection is withheld. You learn to celebrate the bare minimum because anything more feels like asking for too much. You tell yourself that if you're patient enough, loyal enough, chill enough, they'll eventually feel safe enough to love you back. But all that does is teach them that you'll stick around regardless of how they show up. You become the partner who doesn't need to be prioritized, the one who's always understanding, always forgiving, always available, but never truly met. And this is where the heartbreak starts to seep in, because eventually your unmet needs begin to build. The tolerance that once held the relationship together starts to feel like emotional starvation. You look back and realize you've been clapping for someone who never showed up for you. You've convinced yourself that being low maintenance made you strong, when in reality, it made you invisible. And the avoidant? They still see you as the perfect partner, not because they deeply love you, but because you never disrupted their inner world. You became their emotional buffer, absorbing their coldness, their inconsistency, their inability to connect, and they reward you for it with commitment. But it's not a commitment to you as a full human being. It's a commitment to the version of you that keeps them safe from themselves. Being labeled marriage material for how little you need is one of the greatest deceptions in avoidant relationships. It's not about love. It's about emotional efficiency. It's about convenience. It's about knowing that you won't ask for more than they're capable of giving. And so they choose you, not because they see your soul, but because you've proven you won't threaten their emotional walls. You've passed the test, not by being loved, but by being easy to survive. Avoidants don't marry the person they can't live without. They marry the person they can live with while still protecting their emotional autonomy. That's the truth most people don't want to face. They don't choose the one who challenges them to open up or the one who deeply stirs their heart because those relationships feel threatening, too intense, too risky, too unpredictable. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, closeness triggers discomfort. Vulnerability feels unsafe. So when it comes time to choose a life partner, they often default to someone they can manage, someone who fits into their carefully controlled world without disrupting it, someone who won't press them for more intimacy than they're prepared to give, someone who won't ask them to confront their emotional limitations. That person becomes the safe choice, not because of deep connection, but because they pose the least threat to the avoidant's inner structure. It's a subtle process, and it rarely looks intentional. The avoidant doesn't consciously think, let me marry someone I can manage instead of someone I'm afraid to lose. But deep down, that's exactly what's happening. The person they feel the strongest emotional pull toward, the one who triggers their deeper feelings, who sees through their defenses, who challenges their disconnection, also triggers their fear of engulfment. The more they care, the more they retreat. The closer someone gets, the more unpredictable and unsafe it feels. That's why they often sabotage relationships with people they actually love deeply, because that love demands vulnerability. It demands surrender. It demands change. And avoidants are terrified of change when it threatens the illusion of control. So when it comes time to settle down, they seek familiarity, predictability, manageability. They choose the partner who won't confront their avoidance, who won't pressure them for more, who quietly adapts to their emotional distance. This is why so many people in relationships with avoidance feel like they're being tolerated, not cherished. You show up with love, with commitment, with presence, but what gets rewarded is your ability to adjust, to shrink, to not rock the boat, to stay calm when they shut down, to not ask questions when they go quiet. They don't choose you for your fire. They choose you for your silence. for how well you fit into the emotional gaps they've never learned to close. The less you ask of them, the more they convince themselves they can handle being with you. And that's the trap, because instead of choosing love, they choose manageability. Not the person who electrifies their soul, but the one who allows them to stay the same. To the avoidant, love is a threat. It's messy. It brings up wounds. It forces them to feel things they've spent a lifetime avoiding. So they rationalize, this person is too much, too emotional, too needy. But what they're really saying is, this person activates a part of me I don't know how to handle. So they retreat into relationships that feel less intense, less demanding, less dangerous. And because they equate peace with control, the person they can manage becomes the person they marry. Not because there's a deep mutual connection, but because that partner has proven they won't force them to confront the parts of themselves they're trying to avoid. That's the emotional calculus. How much of myself do I have to reveal to be with this person? How much discomfort will I feel if they get too close? Can I keep my emotional distance without being pushed? If the answer is yes, they commit. Not out of love, but out of safety. What's even more heartbreaking is that the partner being chosen may not realize they're being selected for how little they require. They may think their patience is being rewarded, their loyalty, their willingness to understand the avoidance coldness and inconsistency. But in reality, they're being chosen for how well they manage the avoidance discomfort, for how little they disrupt the emotional stasis. They become the path of least resistance, not because of who they are, but because of what they don't ask for. And over time, that starts to feel like rejection, wearing the mask of acceptance. Like being picked, but not deeply seen. Like being in a relationship, but emotionally alone. Avoidants don't want to lose control, so they avoid the kind of relationships where they could lose someone. Because to lose someone, you first have to let them all the way in. And letting someone in means giving up control. It means letting go of emotional self-protection. It means risking pain. And for the avoidant, pain is always more threatening than emptiness. So they choose emptiness in a manageable form. They choose a partner who's emotionally self-sufficient, who won't need too much, who won't call them out, who won't mirror back their emotional detachment. That's not partnership. That's performance. And they perform best when the other person lets them stay behind the curtain, undisturbed, unchallenged, and unseen. Silence becomes a test, and you keep passing. Not because you're winning, but because you're enduring. When you're in a relationship with an avoidant partner, silence isn't just absence. It's measurement. It's a gauge, a test, a behavioral litmus strip they use to see how much you'll tolerate. They go quiet and they wait, they pull back and they watch. Will you chase them? Will you get angry? Will you demand closeness, answers, or effort? Or will you stay calm, stay silent, stay patient, yet again? When you choose silence, not because it reflects your truth, but because it keeps the peace, you're unintentionally signaling something to the avoidant. I won't threaten your distance. I won't pressure you to show up. I'll be right here when you're done avoiding me. And for someone who fears emotional demands, that becomes the most comfortable kind of partner. Not the one who sees them, not the one who challenges them, but the one who passes every unspoken test by choosing silence over self-respect. Avoidants subconsciously use withdrawal to control the emotional temperature in the relationship. When things feel too intimate, too vulnerable, too close for comfort, they disappear. Emotionally, physically, or both. And instead of talking about it, they go quiet. They don't explain, they don't reassure, and they certainly don't lean in. Because to them, leaning in feels like a threat to their autonomy. So they disappear into themselves, into distraction, into distance. And when you respond with silence, when you don't call them out, when you don't speak your pain, when you act like everything's fine, it reinforces the belief that they don't have to be emotionally accountable, that you'll be there regardless, that their silence won't cost them your presence. And that's the quiet contract that forms. They test you with their withdrawal, and you pass by staying silent. Not because it's what you want, but because you're afraid of pushing them further away. Over time, that silence becomes a cycle, a pattern you normalize. You stop bringing up your needs. You stop asking for more. You train yourself to expect less. You turn your emotional hunger into emotional numbness just to keep the relationship intact. You begin to believe that your silence is strength, that you're being mature, grounded, unshakable. But inside, you're crumbling, because the silence you think is saving the relationship is actually suffocating you. It's burying your voice, your longing, your worth. And yet, the more you pass these silent tests, the more the avoidant sees you as safe. They interpret your lack of protest as compatibility. Your tolerance becomes proof that you're the right person because you don't ask for what they're unwilling to give. Each silent episode teaches the avoidant that emotional withdrawal works. That discomfort can be avoided, that if they shut down long enough, the pressure will dissolve because you'll adapt. You always do. And without realizing it, you start to reward their silence with loyalty, with patience, with emotional self-sacrifice. You become the steady hand that never shakes, the rock that never moves, the partner who takes the emotional hit every time just to keep the relationship standing. And they never have to say a word. They don't have to communicate clearly, express remorse, or show emotional consistency, because your silence fills in all the blanks. It makes excuses. It keeps the peace. It does all the heavy lifting while they get to hide behind their walls and call it just how I am. But make no mistake, this is not mutual understanding. This is one-sided emotional labor dressed up as resilience. And every time you stay quiet when you're hurting, every time you pretend their emotional absence doesn't matter, you're telling them, you can hurt me and I'll still stay. You can disappear and I'll be here when you return. That isn't love. That's emotional survival. That's how you become the person who passes every test they never admitted they were giving you. Not because you're thriving, but because you've learned how to tolerate being emotionally starved. Because deep down, you hope that one day your silence will be rewarded with closeness. That if you keep proving how loyal and low maintenance and unshakable you are, they'll finally feel safe enough to open up. But that's not how avoidant attachment works. They don't open up because you've made yourself smaller. They don't feel safer because you've erased your own voice. They just learn that the distance doesn't have consequences. That intimacy can always be postponed. That if they ignore long enough, withdraw deep enough, go quiet for long enough, you'll still be there. And not only will you be there, you'll be waiting in silence, believing that this is what love looks like, believing that this is a test of your strength, not the slow erosion of your self-worth, believing that passing their silence is proof that you're meant to be. But really, it's just proof that they've trained you not to expect anything more. Avoidants confuse survival with stability, and that confusion runs so deep that it ends up dictating who they choose, how they connect, and what kind of love they ultimately accept. When someone has learned, often from early childhood, that vulnerability equals danger and that needing others leads to pain, they don't grow up seeking closeness. They grow up seeking control. Emotional survival becomes their operating system. They don't look for warmth, intimacy, or real connection. They look for emotional predictability. They look for environments and people that allow them to stay in the same guarded state they've always known. And because of that, the relationships they end up calling stable aren't emotionally rich or deeply connected. They're emotionally flat, consistent in their distance, and comfortably numb. It's not love they gravitate toward. It's the absence of emotional threat. They don't know how to recognize genuine safety, so they settle for emotional survival and label it stability. That's why avoidants often find themselves in relationships that look low drama on the outside but feel emotionally vacant on the inside. They believe they've found peace when in reality, they've just found someone who lets them maintain their emotional armor. They think, this is the most stable relationship I've ever had. But what they're really saying is, this is the first time I haven't been asked to emotionally stretch. They mistake the absence of emotional risk for emotional health. But that's the trick survival plays on them. Because survival mode doesn't recognize connection. It only recognizes safety in the form of distance. They equate stability with partners who don't rock the boat, who don't challenge their shutdowns, who don't mirror back their avoidant behavior. And so they keep choosing relationships that let them remain emotionally hidden because being seen still feels unsafe. This is especially true when the avoidant finally feels ready for something serious. They might have had a few emotionally charged relationships in the past, partners who tried to get close, who stirred something deep inside them, who exposed their emotional gaps, and instead of leaning into that connection, they pulled away. It felt chaotic. It felt dangerous. It felt like too much. So by the time they decide they're ready to settle down, they no longer seek that kind of emotional intensity. They seek familiarity. They look for someone who makes few emotional demands, someone they can function with, someone who keeps things calm. But what they're really doing is replicating the environment they grew up in, one where emotional distance was the norm, one where being emotionally guarded was necessary for survival. And because that feels familiar, it feels right. Not because it's healthy, but because it's known. Avoidants rarely question this instinct because to them, emotional neutrality feels like emotional safety. They don't know what it's like to feel secure and connected at the same time. So when they meet someone who is warm, consistent, emotionally available, it actually feels threatening. Their body responds with discomfort. Their mind starts scanning for red flags. They start to doubt the relationship. They convince themselves that something's off with the other person, or that the connection feels too intense or too needy. But what's really happening is that the presence of genuine intimacy is activating all the defenses they've built over the years. They can't tell the difference between being emotionally uncomfortable because they're growing and being emotionally uncomfortable because they're in danger. So they fall back into what they know. Cold, distant, self-contained relationships that let them maintain the illusion of control. And because those relationships are emotionally survivable, they call them stable. The partners they tend to choose often mistake this dynamic for maturity. They see the avoidant as independent, self-sufficient, drama-free. But over time, they realize they're not in a mutual partnership. They're in a one-sided emotional desert. And yet the avoidant sees no problem because their definition of stability has nothing to do with connection and everything to do with predictability. They believe things are working fine as long as no one is crying, arguing, or demanding more closeness. They don't recognize emotional avoidance as dysfunction. They see it as calm, as peace, as strength. And so the very patterns that were born out of emotional fear get repackaged as adult-level stability. But it's not stability, it's emotional stagnation. It's surviving in a connection that never truly connects. It's choosing familiarity over fulfillment, numbness over nourishment, isolation over intimacy. The saddest part is they often don't realize they're doing this. They may even think they've grown. They'll look at their current relationship and say, this is the most stable thing I've ever had, and feel proud of that. But what they're proud of is how well they've avoided the discomfort of vulnerability, how effectively they've chosen a partner who doesn't disturb their walls, how long they've gone without feeling emotionally threatened. It's a life built on containment, not expansion. And because they've never known what real emotional safety looks like, what mutual vulnerability feels like, they keep mistaking their own shutdown for peace. They call it stability, when it's really just a continuation of their emotional survival tactics, dressed up in adult language and long-term plans. What you tolerate becomes the foundation of the relationship, stone by stone, moment by moment, until one day you look around and realize you've built a life out of silence, out of compromise, out of the little things you let slide. In a relationship with an avoidant partner, this happens slowly, subtly, almost invisibly. At first, it's the unanswered texts you excuse, the emotional shutdowns you rationalize, the missed conversations you tell yourself they're just not ready to have. You want to be understanding. You want to be patient. You want to prove that love doesn't mean pressure. So you stay quiet when they pull away. You soften your tone when you're hurt. You hold back your needs, hoping that by not overwhelming them, they'll eventually feel safe enough to meet you in the middle. But the middle never comes. What you don't speak becomes the new standard. And your silence, that becomes the glue holding everything together. Avoidant partners are hypersensitive to emotional demands. The moment they feel pressured, whether real or imagined, their instinct is to retreat, to shut down, to protect their inner world. And if you're the kind of person who leads with empathy, who fears conflict, or who carries your own abandonment wounds, you start to adapt. You learn to make their comfort more important than your truth. You get good at scanning the emotional landscape, anticipating their moods, minimizing your presence when they're distant. And because your tolerance creates less friction, they lean in, not because they're growing emotionally, but because they feel unthreatened. Your flexibility is mistaken for compatibility. But what's really happening is that you're stretching past your own emotional limits to preserve a connection that doesn't fully hold you. Every relationship is built on patterns, unspoken agreements, invisible contracts, and in avoidant relationships, the contract often reads like this: I will not ask more of you than you're ready to give, as long as you don't leave. And so begins the slow erosion of boundaries, of self-expression, of needs, the moments you swallow your pain, the nights you go to bed feeling unseen, the conversations you never start. They stack up, they don't disappear. They get buried, layer by layer, until they become the quiet foundation of the relationship. The avoidant doesn't notice because their nervous system is calm. You're not triggering them. You're not pressing for more. But your nervous system, it's in a constant state of starvation. And over time, your resilience becomes your prison. Because what you tolerate doesn't just set the tone, it teaches them how to treat you. And that's the hardest part to face. That your kindness, your patience, your self-restraint, all the things you thought were helping, are actually building the framework of a one-sided relationship. You become the emotional container, the safe space, the steady hand, but you're never allowed to fall apart. Never allowed to express too much. Never allowed to ask for something that makes them uncomfortable. And the more you reinforce this, the more they settle into the version of you that doesn't disturb their avoidant rhythm. It doesn't happen maliciously. They don't wake up thinking, I want to neglect my partner today. But they learn through repetition that they can withdraw without consequence, that their emotional absence will not be met with confrontation, that the weight of the relationship will be carried by you quietly, endlessly, invisibly. Tolerance becomes the norm. And the norm becomes expectation. The things that once felt like sacrifices, letting things go, keeping the peace, waiting for them to come around, become non-negotiables. Not because you agreed to it, but because you didn't challenge it. And once something becomes normalized in a relationship, it's much harder to reverse. By the time you try to assert your needs, speak your pain, express your disappointment, they feel shocked, defensive, confused. Why are you changing? Why are you making a big deal out of this now? They don't understand that what feels sudden to them has been building inside you for years, because they've been allowed to exist inside a relationship where you absorb the tension and now your voice feels like disruption. But really, it's a reclamation. What you tolerate shapes the emotional blueprint of the relationship. If you tolerate distance, it becomes the default. If you tolerate silence, it becomes the language. If you tolerate inconsistency, it becomes the pattern, not because you're weak, not because you don't deserve more, but because somewhere along the way, you believed that love meant adjusting yourself to fit someone else's limitations. And avoidants are drawn to that, not because they want to hurt you, but because it feels easier than healing. Your tolerance allows them to keep their wounds untouched, their patterns unchallenged, their hearts guarded. And without realizing it, you stop being a partner. They start seeing you as a cushion, a comfort zone, a place to land without ever having to look inward. The entire dynamic starts to feed on itself. You keep tolerating, they keep avoiding, you keep waiting, they keep withdrawing, and before you know it, the version of love you've created doesn't resemble mutual support, mutual growth, mutual intimacy. It looks more like emotional endurance, a silent agreement that says, I'll keep giving as long as you don't ask me to leave. And as long as you keep tolerating it, the foundation doesn't shift. It just deepens. It hardens. It settles into a structure that keeps you both exactly where you are, disconnected yet attached, together yet emotionally apart. So if you're wondering why they chose you, or why they married someone who lets them stay walled off, don't confuse that with intimacy. They didn't choose who they love the most. They chose who they could lose the least. You're not crazy for seeing the cracks. You're not wrong for feeling empty. But ask yourself this: are you being loved, or are you just being tolerated because you're the one who won't leave? Because putting up with someone isn't love, and being chosen for your silence isn't a win.